Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Chris G Photography. I am actually in one of my favorite places in the world, and really where my photo adventure began. I'm in Rocky Mountain National Park, which is only about an hour and a half from my home in the metro area of Denver, Colorado. But this place is very special to me because, like I said, this is kind of where my photography career began, and right over there is where I took the first picture that when I got the transparency film back from the processor, opened up the box and began to lay the images out on my slide table, said wow. And at the I'm about to walk up a trail, and at the end of this trail is the first time I ever shot a photo with the very milky, blurry water. So today's video is actually a continuation of the series of basically what do these numbers mean, or how the numbers on your camera work. And the inspiration for this series is basically by watching other people's YouTube channels, and sometimes it doesn't seem that people that are newer to photography, in spite of the fact they may take excellent images, be good teachers, have a lot of viewers and followers, they may not completely be comfortable with their cameras. And this series really is about asking that question to you. Are you comfortable with your camera? Are you comfortable with all the numbers and all the settings? Are you just basically taking your camera, dialing everything in until the exposure looks good or the histogram looks good, just to get an image so you can get it home into post-processing and go from there? And maybe even after that is accomplished, you get the image in your camera, get it home, and maybe not still getting the image you want because you might not understand what those numbers on your camera mean, what they affect, and what they control. And today's video is about ISO. I have another video, the previous video to this one is about aperture and shutter speed, and I hope that I can figure out how to link it. So I think, if I'm correct, it would be up here if I link it correctly, up on the right hand side. Now it might be over here, but I'm hoping it's over there. But anyway, it's up here somewhere if I figure it out. And quite honestly, if it's not here, up here somewhere, I'm gonna look rather silly if I don't figure it out. So look up here somewhere for the link to my aperture and shutter speed video. Now I do want to apologize real quick because we had snow come through Colorado yesterday, and I came up here because I anticipated nice fresh snowfall. And as you can see, I'm going to spin around here. I don't know why I'm doing that, but it's very nice and snowy, winter wonderland. But it's a little bit windy up here, and I didn't anticipate that. So hopefully you can hear me. If not, quite honestly, this is take 2 of this video. So I did another one a couple of days ago, and I went to another one of my very favorite spots kind of close to my home, and did this video, and quite honestly, it was embarrassingly bad. I talked about ISO and really didn't explain anything. Got away from my what do these numbers mean thing, and so here's the wind, and I just don't know. First off, if that video's bad, it's actually on YouTube right now, but as soon as I get this one to turn out, I hope, if the wind doesn't interfere with me too much, is I'm going to delete that one and replace it with this video. But if the wind noise is too bad, there's going to be a take 3, so we'll see what happens. But anyway, getting back to ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. And what the International Standards Organization is basically a group that wanted to be sure that units of measure and things like that throughout industry were consistent. So in other words, when Kodak made an ISO 100 film, that ISO 100 film was the same for Kodak and Agfa and Fuji or Ilford or whoever it was, just to be sure that everything was uniform across the board. And so when we're talking about film ISO or digital ISO, what you're really talking about is sensitivity or absorbency. And you might even hear the word speed. And let me explain why. So what those numbers mean is, if you look at your ISO dial, and I'll do an ISO dial video here in a few minutes just to kind of show you what that looks like, but the lower the ISO number, the less sensitive, the less absorbent your film or your sensor is. And so the opposite of that is, oh no, it's getting windier, oh no. I hope you can hear me, because this is actually going better than I thought it was going to go. So the higher the number, the higher the sensitivity, the higher the absorbency. Now, back in the film days, really every time you took a picture, every time you had to really decide what ISO you wanted to use. For example, when I was up here, taking my photos, I chose the lowest ISO I could possibly use. I never shot film faster than 100 ISO when I was up here doing my nature photography. And the reason why is film is actually made out of light sensitive particles of silver. And the lower the ISO, the fewer the particles were. But what that related to was being able to enlarge your photos. And I have photos that I took 20, 25 years ago that are blown up to 20 by 30, and they hold up very well from a 35 millimeter piece of film. And so that's why you chose that. And as the ISO of your film went up, the silver particles, there had to be more of them because the film had to be more absorbent. And the same thing really does apply today with an image sensor. Now, there's no more or less pixels, but the ISO, here comes the wind, the ISO does change how the pixels absorb. The higher the ISO number, the more absorbent those pixels become. And back in the day, when you wanted to make big enlargements, you wanted to use a fine grain, low ISO, so you could get them big. See, the grain of the film was today's equivalent of noise. And if you wanted to make big prints, you didn't want a lot of noise. You didn't want a lot of grain, so you chose a low ISO. But let's say you're not shooting out here. You're shooting, let's say, a sporting event. And you're maybe not making giant prints, but your goal is to stop the motion of an athlete, and maybe you need to pick a little bit higher ISO to get a higher shutter speed. Or perhaps, and I did a lot of sports photography back in the day, is I ended up shooting in a lot of very poor lighting situations in school gymnasiums and football fields, and quite honestly, at night the lighting wasn't good. So I would sometimes have to resort to using extremely high ISO films. Now, I wasn't concerned about the grain because they were being published in school newspapers and yearbooks and that sort of thing. So grain really wasn't the factor, but I had to have the higher ISO to be able to stop the motion of the moving athletes. And so you really had to be more selective back in the day with film because you had to choose the right ISO for your subject. Now, one of the best things I really love about digital photography is the fact that you can change the ISO anytime you want. When I first started photography, when you stuck a ISO 50 roll of film in your camera, that's what you had. It was ISO 50, so if the situation had changed, subject matter had changed, and you needed to higher ISO to change up your light absorbency of your medium, you couldn't do it. And now you can do it just by the turn of a dial. So that's one of the really cool things that I like about digital photography is just the availability or the ability to change up your ISO. So hold on a sec, coming on some people here. Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. So that's one of the things I really love about digital photography is the ability to change ISO anytime you want. And realistically, the rules still apply. The lower the number, the lower the sensitivity. The higher the number, the higher sensitivity. And what those really affect, again, is the choice of your apertures and shutter speeds. Now, I hope you can hear me. I hope this turned out okay, and I hope this is a good enough explanation. I'm sure if you go on YouTube, there are much better explanations of ISO, but this is really not designed to be more than just a nutshell, because what I really would like you to do, and what I encourage you to do, is go out and experiment. And what you're going to see now is me doing some experiments and showing you how different ISOs, choosing different ISOs on your digital camera, affects things, and what they really mean for selecting aperture and shutter speeds. Because if you truly want to have a good amount of control over your photograph, you not only have to select the aperture and shutter speed, but you also have to select the ISO. Now, I have seen some YouTube videos out there about ISO and people claiming that it really doesn't matter anymore. But if, like I said, if you really want to take control and you want to have control over every step of the process, you need to understand ISO, what it affects, and how it's going to affect your final photo. So for now, I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to go set up a camera real quick and just show a look at an average scene and look at the back of the camera, so you can kind of see how changing the ISO changes the appearance and the exposure. And then we're going to go home and we're going to go back to the office and look at some examples. I know the way I do my example photos is probably not the best, but quite honestly, this is the best way I know how to do it. In the future, as I get better at making videos, hopefully I'll change my style a little bit, but for now, this is the best way I know how to do it, even though it's probably not the best way. So for now, this is Chris, and I'll be right back.
Okay, everybody, I am back. We got a little bit of a change of plans. If you recall, I said earlier today when I was in Rocky Mountain National Park that I was going to set my camera up, set it up so it with a correct aperture and shutter speed that just basically showed a correct exposure, and then show you what happens to the histogram, the light meter, and the LCD screen as I just changed the ISO. And unfortunately, that video didn't turn out very well, so quite honestly, I'm just going to skip it. And we're going to go right into looking at some example images. Now, before we do that, I want to say that the reason I'm doing these videos is because I firmly believe that the creative process starts in the camera and not the computer. The computer is an integral part of photography today. However, in my opinion, that if you do not have the image done correctly, if you don't have it exposed correctly, you do not have the correct aperture and shutter speed to convey what you're trying to do. Aperture, again, controls depth of field. So do you want a shallow depth of field to emphasize the subject, or you want a great depth of field to have a lot of things in focus? And then you have the shutter speed, which controls whether something's going to be frozen in motion or something's going to actually show motion. And quite honestly, it might not even matter because maybe the subject's not moving at all. And so this doesn't matter whether using a tripod or handheld, it doesn't really matter. However, in saying that, sometimes you might want to use a slightly higher ISO to get a slightly faster shutter speed when you're hand holding, just to kind of help with the jitters a little bit, even if you're using a stabilization lens. Just kind of throwing that out there for now. But when I go out and take pictures, probably the first question you want to know, and you want to cut right to the chase, is, Chris, what ISO should I use? And my own personal method is I do not have a set ISO that I pick. I do not put my camera I have it set in auto right now, but I do not do that. I will basically go into any situation and use the lowest ISO that I can get away with for what I'm trying to accomplish with the image. The ISO that gives me the aperture that I'm looking for, the shutter speed that I'm looking for, and maintains a correct exposure. That is what I'm trying to do. So I will vary this with every situation. There is not a one-size-fits-all answer here. Matter of fact, there's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer for anything in photography. So I've got a series of images that I want to show you as examples on how ISO affects your image, what it really controls. So the first shot here, the first series I have, is your typical blurry water shot. This is industry standard. If you're going to photograph a stream, now this is the way people think it should look, and that's fine. I've been doing streams like this for a very, very long time. And if you look at my video on aperture and shutter speed, there's actually some good examples in there, and actually why I think the blurry water does kind of work. So for this beginning image, I chose ISO 80, which on this camera is the lowest you can get. And that ended up, I have the camera in aperture priority, so that ends up giving me a shutter speed of 1/5 of a second. But because I wanted to maintain a certain depth of field, in other words, I wanted to be sharp up here, sharp down here, I had to use a small aperture, f16, to get that done. Now, let's say you don't like the way this looks. Let's say you want to change the way the water looks. You want to actually begin to stop the motion of the water. So let's take a look at the rest of the images. And again, all I'm doing is changing the ISO, which will in turn change the shutter speed. ISO 80 at 1/5 of a second. ISO 200 at 1/12 of a second. ISO 400 at 1/25 of a second. ISO 800 at 1/50th of a second. ISO 1600 at 1/100th of a second. And ISO 3200 at 1/200th of a second. And honestly, I could have kept going. I could have actually gone up to 6400 and 12,500 and 25,800 ISO and probably got a shutter speed fast enough to completely stop this water, and where you would see a lot more individual bubbles and stuff like that. So this is what I'm talking about when I say the creative process begins in the camera, and it's really up to the photographer how you want it to look and how your creative control lies within the aperture, shutter speed, and is affected by the ISO. Very important to understand what these numbers are. And I encourage everybody to go out and do a lot of experimentations. This is digital, folks. We can shoot all day, look at our images on the computer, delete them off the card, and move on with our business. Anything you can do to help yourself improve your photography knowledge. In other words, how the camera works and how to get that initial image to look the way you want it to look. So when you get into the computer, you're not frustrated at the end of it, because no matter what you do, no matter how much you post-process, it just doesn't look the way you want to. Maybe there's not enough depth of field, or maybe, for example, the moving water thing just doesn't look right because your aperture and your shutter speed combination just were not right for what you were trying to do. Now, it is really up to the photographer how they want to do this. And so don't ever let anybody tell you how a photo should look. Yes, this is the way most people think a water shot should look. But if you don't like that, don't take that. I'm not saying that people are going to like your photos, but if you don't like it, you can now hopefully learn to control the situation so you can dictate how they turn out. The next series of photos is probably a little bit more real world, going out and taking some pictures of a football game. Now, this particular situation is, I had my Fuji 100 to 400 on there, and at 400 millimeters, the maximum aperture is 5.6. And that's why, honestly, these people in the background are out of focus, but they are not completely blurred out. And for example, like this is Diamond right here, the aunt of the person who is on this football team that I'm photographing. This is not the person I know on the football team. He's actually on defense. So, and this is a running back. So wrong guy. And if you look right over here, here's my wife. So there's enough focus in the background for me to see it. But I wanted to get a fast shutter speed, fast enough to stop the motion on the field, stop the motion of the players. And so in this particular case with the lighting, I was able to go with 1/400th of a second, or excuse me, ISO 400 to get 1/250th of a second. And as you can see, it stopped the motion pretty good. But I was a bit concerned that the 1/250th of a second was not fast enough to stop the motion. So I eventually moved up to ISO 800. Now, the light was changing, so I wasn't able to get a full stop. So if this was a full stop, I would be at 1/500th of a second. So actually 1/400th of a second from 1/250th of a second is actually 2/3 of a stop. Now, honestly, 2/50th of a second would have been just fine. So didn't make that much of a difference. It's only 2/3 of a stop, but as you can see, it is still very, very clean. The motion is still frozen very good. And so I accomplished what I was trying to do. And So in this particular case, the lowest ISO I could get away with was ISO 800. Now, the next sequence of photos, I just did an experiment because I wanted to show you how ISO affects a photograph. I literally stepped out into my backyard and picked an aperture and a shutter speed and just shot the city below my home. Now, the aperture that I picked was 2.8 because obviously it's dark. It's 9 o'clock at night, so it's pitch black. The sun is down, and the shutter speed that I picked was 1 second. Now I kept 2.8 at 1 second for the entire series of photos. And so this is just to kind of show you what ISO does if that's the only thing you change. So this is ISO 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800. Oops, sorry, went too fast, too far there. So as you can see, all I did was change the ISO, and this basically looks like daylight right now. This is actually the color of this dried grass in the field. This is a little bit blue, but this is pretty much what my back fence looks like. Now, if you'll notice, extremely bright areas like right here, this is a skate park that's about 3/4 of a mile away from my home, and these streetlights down here blew out. But as you can see, it looks daylight out. It looks daylight out right now. So, and that's what increasing the ISO can do for you. Now, here's the trade-off with digital, using a high ISO in digital, just like film. Whereas film, we were concerned about grain, now we're concerned about noise. So let's blow this up and check out the noise. And as you can see, it is very, very noisy. If I didn't know this was dried grass in a field, you could not discern that at all. I mean, you do have a tree there, and if we keep going, I mean, it's bad. Now, obviously, you can do a lot in post-processing as far as noise reduction, but that is the trade-off. Just like film, there is a trade-off with using high ISOs. I think this is a great example of that. And let's go back through these images again. So if I were going to say which exposure I liked the best, I'd probably go with this one because the highlights aren't burned out so bad. The snow, you can still see color and all that. So I'd probably go with this one as the correct exposure. So having the ability to change your ISO at any time is very helpful. Now, I want to revisit something I just said as far as my personal belief in how to select the proper ISO. I said I always choose the lowest ISO that I can get away with for what I'm trying to accomplish. However, in the digital world, my mind is changing slightly. So this is an image, excuse me, this is an image I took down at Great Sand Dunes National Park just a couple of days ago. And I was shooting with my GFX 50, my GFX 50R, let's get that right. And the camera was actually set at ISO 250. And I knew that, and I didn't bother it. If you look on YouTube and you do your own experimentation, you will see that ISO, as far as noise and ISO, you don't get a lot of noise, you don't gain a lot of noise until somewhere after ISO 400. I'm not exactly sure where that is. It's not far past. It's probably about a third or 2/3 of a stop past that. Excuse me, I'm having some voice problems. But in the past, if I would have been doing this in the film days, this would have been Fuji Velvia 50, and that's that. That's what I shot it at. And when you're shooting film, again, if you're not getting the aperture and shutter speed, you're kind of stuck within those parameters. But now I am not as afraid, I'm not as leery to use a higher ISO without going crazy and still maintain a good result. Again, this is ISO 250. I do believe I was shooting right around f22 on this because I wanted a lot of depth of field. So in the digital world, my mind is changing a little bit, and I'm coming around a little bit to using higher ISOs in certain situations and not really fretting about it and not worrying about the noise, because you're not going to get that much noise difference between ISO 80 and, let's say, ISO 400. So it's not as bad as it used to. Like I said, in the past, when I was doing my nature stuff, I would not even dream of using a film faster than 100 because I wanted to make those into enlargements. And again, film is made out of pieces of light sensitive silver. The lower the ISO number, the finer those particles of silver, the bigger you could blow it up. And in most cases, you actually had fine grained film and a larger piece of film, so you could blow them up even more. So for now, do me a favor, like, view, and subscribe. Let me know what you think about this video, if it's helpful. And I hope you got something out of this. I'm trying to get my legs underneath me as far as photo education again. I did this for a very long time, many years ago, and I'm just now getting back into it. So I really hope I helped you out. I hope you found this informative. And thank you for watching.